Yes, I'm here.
Right. A very warm welcome to everyone in this lecture on Homopopulism, a new layer of LGBTQ politics in India by Dr. Niharika Banerjea, organized by the Queer Studies Research Cluster, which is a network of researchers working on queer studies in various disciplinary fields in India. A quick word of introduction on Niharika. She's an Associate Professor of Sociology at the School of Liberal Studies, Ambedkar University, Delhi. She's also associated with Sappho for Equality, an activist forum working to address socio-political marginalization of lesbian, bisexual women, and trans men in Eastern India. She identifies as an academic activist as a way to critically address familiar binaries between academia and activism in classrooms, in activist spaces, and in writing practices. Across all these sites, along with her co-thinkers, co-writers, and co-workers, Niharika tries to make theory relevant to interrogate everyday hegemonic relations, as well as interrogate self-referential understandings of lived experiences. Niharika also identifies as queer, and this identification includes an assemblage of socio-political histories of varied journeys rather than an already arrived moment. Thank you so much for being here, and I'd hand over the microphone to Niharika.
Okay, thank you very much, Ekabuli and the Queer Studies Research Cluster for inviting me today to share my thoughts around homopopulism. Um, I would like to say at the outset that I'm using this opportunity today to share some of my preliminary thoughts around homopopulism. And so I earnestly hope that I will receive some questions that will push me to sharpen my analysis and thoughts. Um, so in my presentation, Ekabuli is, you can hear me, right?
Yes, I can.
Yes, okay. So in my presentation today, I argue for nuancing the understanding of mobilization of LGBT star Q identities with homopopulism in contexts where queer politics cannot be understood in absolute, inclusive, exclusive, and juridico-political terms. Sexuality in general and queer in particular are value-laden political objects and projects. With the rise of the queer sexuality question along with the women/gender question, LGBTQ rights has become central to nation, nationality, and citizenship formation. From its incorporation in development agendas to recognition of its varying identities and expressions as figures of life, sexuality and sexuality rights are a primary organizing concern for national states, international human rights organizations, and international financial institutions. States in the global north, international human rights, financial, and development organizations use sexuality rights and equality legislations as a meter to measure democratic progress and backwardness of nations, as well as to determine and disburse development aid. At the same time, select national states in the global south deploy sexuality to define and redefine themselves around questions of independence, cultural pasts, development, and future growth. Against this background, the Indian scene presents a unique situation. So, a new layer of sexuality politics is solidifying in India. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Hinged between older colonial discourses, contemporary neoliberal systems, and neo-fascist processes, sexuality in general and LGBT star Q identities in particular is being explicitly and implicitly mobilized to create, claim, and resist the present social. This includes left and liberal efforts to include and represent LGBT star QIA identified bodies in election promises, workplace, and in the media, with effects that are tilted heavily toward middle to upper middle class, able caste Hindu bodies. Alongside these groups and individuals such as Queer Hindu Alliance and a well-known transgender activist Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi and others are working to claim a stake in the Hindutva regime. Parallel to this, the bodies and voices of trans star and queer feminist persons aim and struggle to connect with Muslim and Dalit individuals and groups around citizenship, democracy, and sedition. I'm engaged in an attempt to comprehend these unique and tumultuous moments through the concept of homopopulism. I'm going to share my screen briefly now. Here we are.
Yes.
Slideshow. Okay. You can see my screen, right? Yeah. So I argue that homopopulism offers a useful entry point into left liberal and centrist state practices uses populist discourses and methods to gradually mobilize LGBT*Q identities for specific political projects without necessarily having to create a recognizable population group with affirmative action policies and anti-discriminatory guarantees, which are facilitating conditions for a livable life. In this sense, homopopulism needs to be understood as a popular modality to relate to the political in shifting contexts of inclusion-exclusion of LGBT*Q identities. So this is the presentation structure in the following parts of the discussion. First, I will delineate the contextual theoretical imperative for homopopulism. Following that, I will focus on the status practices, corporate agendas, and media representations to chart out select sites on which homopopulist discourses are visible. I will end with some concluding comments about counter voices to homopopulism, which I seek in places that are necessarily not about LGBT*Q claims to identity and rights, but about generating critiques, urgent critiques to violent states as queer subjects. So I first go on to discuss the contextual theoretical imperatives of homopopulism. Stop sharing the screen now. So LGBT*Q politics in India, informed by global neoliberal modernities, is regularly analyzed through the lens of homo nationalism and homo Hindu nationalism. Homo nationalism is an important political lens to understand how queer subjects, once figures of death and disease, are folded into and align themselves with nationalist projects and agendas as figures of life and productivity. Jasbir Puar's now widely circulated concept was initially developed to understand how queer is complicit with an imperial nation state, and then later on to see how the US nation state used acceptance and tolerance of LGBT rights as a meter to test and assess degrees of national sovereignty. Since then, the term has traveled to explain the various linkages between activism for LGBT*Q civil rights, the emergence of the global queer subject, pinkwashing, and imperial politics. Broadly, homo-nationalism functions, as Leon says, as a political keyword and offers necessary tools for re-articulating a democratic and inclusive queer politics within a simultaneous articulation of a war on terror. Now, within the Indian context, the term is commonly used to mark the articulation of LGBTQ visibility and rights through nationalist symbols and pride marches, and the intensified attachments of the queer body to nationalist politics. A related term, Homo-Hindu nationalism, is in circulation in recent years to highlight casteist and Islamophobic articulations of gay voices. Upadhyay deploys the term Homo-Hindu nationalism to specifically refer to a set of transnational Brahminical and Islamophobic Hindutva voices that propagates the liberation of a purported gender non-conforming friendly Hinduism from colonial homophobia. Now, liberation, of course, in this discourse also means a return from exile, that is, the once exiled queers, in consonance with the Ghar Wapsi agenda, now needs to be part of the Hindu fold, of course, after being de-homoed through conversion therapy. Homo nationalism and Homo Hindu nationalism together are two useful set of concepts to interrogate the Brahminical and Islamophobic connections between the Hindu right-wing politics, neoliberalizing economies, and LGBTQ politics around India. Nevertheless, I argue that they encounter some limitations as a standalone explanatory framework. While useful to articulate queer complicity with global Islamophobic and Brahminical statist practices, Homo nationalism and Homo Hindu nationalism are unable to explain why LGBTQ identities continue to be mobilized for specific political projects and corporate agendas, and yet remain without livelihood and anti-discrimination guarantees, both of which are facilitating conditions for a livable life. Homopopulism, I argue, can be useful as an additional explanatory lens to refer to a condition in which state actors, and in resonance sometimes with corporate and media entities, interpolate sexual subjects for advancement of select political projects without having to fulfill any social and economic obligations. Now, before I move on to discuss some instances in our present context, let me say that last year, after I thought about the term homopopulism, I came across one usage of this term in the context of Europe. Lotter and Fourie deploy homopopulism to indicate how LGBTQ identified individuals and groups are rejecting queer asylum seekers from Africa by supporting and or endorsing populist nationalist entities and rhetoric in the European Union and its member states. I now move on to elaborate select moments in the Indian context that can be read through a homopopulist lens. So this is the next of the discussion. Sorry. Yes, so this is the next section. And can you also see me actually while I shared the screen?
No, I can see the screen and just the screen.
Okay, all right. So I'll just stop sharing that if it's useful. So LGBTQ is not a developmental category in the Indian polity and policy framework, unlike in the United States, UK, and EU member states. They are also not a favored minority with juridico-political guarantees who are mobilized to address or resolve contentious national or international matters, as we see is the case in the US, UK, and EU states. Yet, in recent years, bodies are interpellated as queer in status practices, corporate agendas, and media representations. I argue that this can be understood as homopopulist measures that are used to further specific projects and discourses of belonging, corporate welfare, and inclusive media representation. Now, conceptually, I'm drawing from the work of Mudd and Kaltwasser to understand populism as a thin-centered ideology and therefore malleable. Mudd and Kaltwasser suggest that because populism is thin, it articulates itself with other ideologies, such as liberalism and nationalism, in order to promote specific political agendas and projects. In its very basic premise, in order to create moral ground, populism works by creating an opposition between the pure people and corrupt elite, and the people in populism is understood as sovereign. At the same time, it functions, as Laclau says, as an empty signifier, because of which it has the capacity to appeal to different social groups. Let us now look at some instances to mark the moments of such populism in our context. So, you know, if we look at the, as far as examples are concerned, I'd like to first share, you know, the examples from, from the 2019 national election season. What we see, we don't have to go through this entire, election manifestos right now, but I just want you to quickly make a note of the CPIM manifesto, which of course talks about a whole host of rights and reservation regarding what they say as the transgender, that's it, not persons or population or anything. And then, of course, we have the Congress Manifesto, which highlights some of the rights according to them under the subtitle Swabhiman, or self-esteem for the deprived. And then last but not the least, you have the BJP Manifesto, which talks about inclusive development and empowering transgenders and so on. And you know, each of these manifestos, which were publicized in 2019, they refer either implicitly or explicitly to first juridical inclusion in reference to key legal flashpoints in India's recent history, and which are number one, the Nalsa judgment or the National Legal Services Authority versus Union of India case, 14th April 2014, which, as many of us know, upheld the rights of Indians to self-identify their gender, irrespective of gender affirmation surgery. Secondly, the second, legal flashpoint that is mentioned in these manifestos is, of course, the 6th September 2018 Navtej Johar, versus Union of India case. And then the third one is, which is not mentioned here, but which we already have, is the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Bill 2019, that is supposed to safeguard the welfare of transgender persons in India, but in effect has taken away a key right of self-identification and insists that transgender identification will require a transgender certificate that will have to be then obtained by elaborate medical legal procedures. Further, we also know that the bill does not make any concrete provisions for healthcare, employment, and educational opportunities, and even trivializes the impact of sexual abuse on trans persons. Now, all three manifestos, albeit with some differences, uses the language of rights and national developmental, idioms such as empowerment, reservation, swabhiman, without really giving any kind of guarantees as such to demonstrate a popular support for LGBTQ concerns. And the national elections last year also witnessed queer candidatures, that is the presence of persons identifying as LGBT in the electoral polls. Those who have either contested the elections as LGBT identified individuals, and those politicians who support queer rights have made it to a list called the Pink List, a list created by 3 individuals who are interested in making queer rights a political imperative. I argue that each of these attempts are populist moves without any reference to how these rights are going to be consolidated, or without any reference to struggles by social groups on the ground as to what sexual and gender minorities are asking for. Now, if we see that this kind of I'm going to quickly share the screen again, that, so this is, also resonated in some senses in the media. The media at the time, through advertisement, promotional videos and films, is equally committed to representing and, I am going ahead of myself. That screen that I shared was to highlight the corporate sector, which resonating with the political processes have begun adopting affirmative human resources policies for its LGBTQ identified employees, contributing its own bit in connecting its policies through national development idioms such as empowerment, as is seen, here in realizing the national flag. So far, there are reports of some IT companies offering medical insurance to same-sex partners of their employees, as well as coverage for gender reassignment surgery. What we see is that the media also, through advertisement, promotional videos, and films, is equally committed to representing and celebrating non-normative desires, non-normative within quotes. The first image points to a still from a much circulated 2015 online advertisement by a clothing brand depicting two cis middle-class women in a romantic erotic relationship, with one of them preparing to reveal her relationship to her mother, who is going to visit soon. The second image is a still from a poster of a 2019 film, Ek Ladki Ko Dekha To Aisa Laga, which is, as many of you know, a queer take from an iconic Bollywood song from the blockbuster 1994 film set in the pre-independence context of 1942. And these speak of a moment where queer bodies are becoming significant in the representation of middle classness. In these and similar other efforts, we see the kind of familiar tropes that are emerging here. Now, what is common across all the above discussed three registers, the statist practices, corporate, and the media, is an attempt to present the previously marginalized within a familiar language of rights and middle and upper middle class social codes. This presentation does, have these presentations that you saw, they do have familiar national developmental idioms, and has opened up contradictory positions around who is to be granted the norms of respectable citizenship and on what terms. Further, these are focal points around which social actors and institutions are defining simultaneities with liberal democracies in the global north and difference with other nations in the global south. This is a specific kind of popular relationality that is popular precisely because it draws upon a familiar temporal trope of having arrived and not yet arrived, a key way in which third world differences lived and understood around the presence or lack of LGBTQ rights. So that a certain kind of coded, coded body is in the front face of state, corporate, and media discourses around LGBT*Q inclusions is not surprising. But yet, as I alluded to before, these attempts at inclusion are populist, given that in our case, they are attached to explicit political projects. Let me illustrate further with the BJP stand. Now, the BJP stand toward non-normative sexual identities, expressions, and ways of living have shifted from a violent reaction in the late 1990s to saying that homosexuality is a concern for elites and is an import from there, that is the West, to neither contesting nor advocating for Section 377 when it was in the court, and to now championing for economic inclusiveness for transgender persons. This shifting position has been welcomed by certain queer and queer activists who are publicly aligning with the Hindu right. What are we to make of this? Now, in discussing the significance of queer genders and sexualities to post-colonial right-wing Hindu nationalisms, Paula Bacchetta argues that within discourses of Hindu nationalism, queerphobia does not necessarily present itself in isolation, but reworks colonial sexual and gender normativities and presents itself with xenophobia. This occurs in two ways. Xenophobic queerphobia operates by constructing the self, and I quote her, constructing the self-identified Indian queer as originating outside the nation. And queerphobic xenophobia works by assigning queer genders and sexualities to all the designated others of the nation, regardless of sexual conduct or identity. Therefore, the shifting position of the right-wing state toward the queer subject, I argue, needs to be situated within the larger populist ethno-nationalism of Hindutva that claims to represent the people against a common enemy. In a recent edited collection on the majoritarian state, Chatterjee, Hansen, and Jaffrelot argue that national populism is a consequence of the claim that the people are both victims and true inhabitants of the land. Majoritarian national populism functions by centralizing political authority rule by charismatic leaders, and circumvention of civil liberties, all of which are part of the larger political culture of the Indian polity. Hence, violent, casteist, and jingoistic narratives that are integral to the continuity of the Indian state sits quite comfortably with queerphobic, xenophobic practices and has not led to an opening up of government bureaucracies to affirmative policies for queers, or even a minimal discussion about violence and discrimination against LGBT star QIA identified persons. So it is clear that the third world queer subject in state, corporate, and media discourses, understood as cis and trans, caste Hindu, middle to upper class, and urban, is not waiting to be rescued by the global north, but is the one who has been able to enter majoritarian popular politics. In many instances, it is also perfectly postured to join the prized global League of Nations that accord legal recognition to its queers and, different kinds of protections. But it is limiting to use this subject to understand the many faces of the queer movements in India. In India's ethno-national populism, this subject is a numerical minority that co-authorizes a populist majoritarian right-wing politics and cannot constitute a meta-narrative about LGBT star QIA politics in India, as they do not serve anti-discriminatory queer interests. In order to therefore avoid a meta-narrative of LGBT star QIA politics in India, I argue for using the lens of homopopulism to engage deeper with the connections between the queer subject within national populisms in general and ethno-nationalists in particular. Now, the last slide that I'm going to share with you is this. Some of you, which again, you will be familiar with this. Both of these, and here I end with some concluding thoughts, that both of these images are stills from posters that were designed and carried by my fellow co-travelers and friends in Mumbai and Kolkata during the last, Women March for Change in April last year, ahead of the national elections. The one to the left reads, "Smash the cis heteronormative Brahminical capitalist patriarchies," and the one to the right, when translated, reads, "Women and trans persons are saying down with fascism, and women on the streets are calling to change the day through this vote." This march was organized by several collectives. Um, um, this march was, organized by several collectives, organizations, and unions comprising cis women, trans persons, farmers, students, lawyers, activists, and artists. It was held across various cities in India against a stated politics of violence and hate, as many of you will know. So through this, I'm trying to draw your attention to counter voices to homopopulist moments, which I see in places that are necessarily not about LGBT star Q claims to identity and uncritical acceptance of rights, but about generating urgent critiques to violent states as queer subjects. Genderqueer and gender variant individuals, transmasculine persons, cis women in lesbian relationships with economically modest or marginalized backgrounds, cis queer and trans star persons who are Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, Muslim, um, and voices from the seven states of Northeast of India, all of whom are part of the fearful others in a national populist state, are today struggling to survive, live, and be part of movements with extreme limitations of mobility and security. Whether these voices can be followed and read as a radical popular politics remains to be seen. But at this moment, we need to hold on to these voices to imagine livable presence and refusing pre-decided futures. Thank you. And I end here, and I'm hoping that this will generate some questions.
Thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, I would ask them to raise their hands. And in the meantime, I just had this one comment, not exactly a question, is that you mentioned the CPIM. the Communist Party of India, Marxist, which had been one of the leading members of the Left Front in West Bengal, which had been in power till 2011. I was wondering that, considering that they claim the title communist, which to a certain degree implies a certain kind of progressive politics, maybe even a certain kind of feminist politics, though it's not a feminist politics everybody can agree with. I was wondering that within the CPIM left, there are factions of feminists who push for more inclusion of the LGBT agenda, and you have the old CPIM in West Bengal, which is more of the Brahminical Savarna, the silver-haired CPIM patriarch that we are so familiar with and we love to make fun of. So I was wondering, and eventually what happens within the left, not just CPIM, but many other left organizations, is that this certain group of progressive young feminists or eventually get sidelined, and they end up working with forums which organize marches, like women's marches and so on and so forth. Do you think that that homopopulism as it is emerging has its tentacles way deeper in political organizations, rather way deeper than we can eventually actually try to figure out in terms of the makings of homopopulism? Perhaps it's not something that's emerging out of the blue in corporate sectors and so on. It's a process that has been going on for a long time, whose culmination is as we see it now.
Yes, Ekavoli, thank you for that very important question. And I'm definitely going to keep that in mind as I develop this project, that the making of the popular politics. And you're absolutely, right in that sense that this is not out of the blue. And there is a history of popular politics in India, of which the left parties, including the CPIM, is also very much a part. And yes, I would definitely, I don't have a full answer to your question, but yes, it would be definitely very important to look into the, if one is doing an organizational investigation or interrogation of political parties to see how deep the populist, politics in each of these party political outfits lie, then we would have to go way back. So as we would have to for CPIM, as we would have to do for BJP and Congress. Absolutely, you're absolutely right. Yes. And interestingly, if you look at the manifesto, of the CPIM, they have a few things, but then the heading is transgender.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that is something
it's a very
offensive.
It's very offensive. So and then there is just no it's like a very hurriedly put together thing, but and that's the thing, that it's a very popular, it will give some, there are some keywords there that gives a popular feeling to it, that okay, now there is some inclusion. But yeah, I'm very thankful to you for that question of needing to look into the organizational histories. Thank you for that.
It also reminds me of this one time in Jadavpur University when we were, the university said that they would make trans-inclusive bathrooms, and all kinds of media ran headlines, which was like Jadavpur University to make transgender toilets, which was, it made it sound like the toilets themselves were transgender. So that maybe that is another instance of this kind of populist politics that we see every day. I would request people to ask other questions, please.
Yeah, questions, clarifications, anything. And I would
Sneha has a question. Uh,
I think Niharika ma'am muted herself.
Ma'am, could you please unmute?
Yes, Sneha, please go ahead. And Chand also has a question. Yeah.
Yes. So I have some thoughts and overall questions and just wonderings. So first thing that I would like to ask you is that in terms of when you're talking about homopopulism and you're talking about a sort of a certain section of queer politics kind of aligning itself with right wing politics, because it sees because again we kind of make monoliths out of identity politics, and we don't realize that there might be different kinds of interests within the community, quote unquote community as well. So do you think that that kind of informs this kind of a study when you're thinking about why certain people would vote a certain way, or align themselves with a certain kind of right-wing politics, despite the social narrative they may have had and may still continue to have? And like for example, there is a lot of study that happens on why certain sections of the black population votes Republican a lot of times, which has to do with Christianity also. And because you also talk about othering and how everyone wants to eventually align themselves to or rather a lot of interest groups want to align themselves to being a part of the nation as opposed to being the other within the nation, and as citizens as well. So that, I mean, do you think about it in terms of also how interests um, are not always going to be the same within any kind of an identity community, and why that happens? And the other question I wanted to ask you is that in terms of media representation also, like a lot of times only a certain section of the LGBT population gets represented heavily, especially in Indian media, in terms of uh, cis gay men being represented a lot, and the also the kind of reception that it receives, like with this film Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan. This movie was highly problematic, and the representation was wrong in a lot of ways, but it was very, very well represented, very, very well received among a lot of cis gay men. So I mean, what I'm trying to say is that is uh, um, are there sections within the population then, or within the community then, who are okay with representation as long as it kind of you know uh, helps their narrative, or helps popularize only their narrative within, or helps hegemonize their narrative within the community also, so yeah, that those are my two questions.
Should I answer that, Ekaboli, and then go ahead to the next one? Okay.
Yes, of course.
Okay. All right. Sneha, thank you for the question. As to why certain people, individuals and groups who may align with some violent narratives, uh, I really wouldn't have one answer to that, because um, that question also assumes that queer by itself, although it's an ironical term, that queer is supposed to go against the normative, but how it becomes, how it, enters into or becomes renormative in certain senses. So there could be a whole host of reasons. I mean, why do human beings align with certain discourses, certain material practices that are discriminatory? One, because and that's a social psychological question. So I think the question to your question is, we probably think that just because I am practicing or expressing or living a life with a different, desire, means that I will automatically be politically acute in my sensibilities. That really does not, equate always. But, the thing that I'm arguing here is that there has been, the reason why I'm arguing for homopopulism is because there has been a tendency to create a meta-narrative about LGBTQ IA politics in India, that it is asking for rights and therefore it is homo nationalist, or it is asking for, representation, and therefore it is within the Indian nation, and therefore it is Homo-Hindu nationalist. Rather, what I'm trying to, I guess, say is that if we can break that down a little bit and think about what are the kinds of ways in which individuals and groups, who identify as LGBTQ also align with the state, then we are probably able to have that connection between popular politics and queer complicity, and also not look at the politics, LGBTQ politics, as a homo populist politics or a homo nationalist politics or a homo Hindu nationalist politics. That's what I'm trying to say. So if we are able to break it down and see exactly what are the linkages, what is it that they are linking to, what is it that it is appealing. There is a, populism has a certain kind of appeal. Now, again, going back to your question that why do certain individuals because there is a there could be a need for national belonging, there could be a need not to upset any of my privileges and comforts that I have, and there could be a whole host of reasons, and therefore looking at the popular legitimacy or the popular base of why people are aligning with that may help to understand the appeal of of populism as it attaches itself to nationalism and a certain understanding of rights and so on. I don't know if I've been able to answer your question, but Chand wants to ask a question,
Yes,
and Philip has two questions.
yes, Chand and Philip.
Can I ask?
Yes, sure, sure.
Ma'am, I had two questions. One is that you talked about how state media and corporates have, in the homo nationalist framework and the representations of LGBTI persons within it. I wanted to ask you, when we look at the NGO sector in India, the NGO sector in India is also very diverse, very broad. So how does one place this development sector within this homo populist framework? And within this, I wanted to ask that we have a lot. Within this, I wanted to ask that in India, it is also very difficult for NGOs to do political, in quotes, political work, like fighting for rights very often because of FCRA norms and all of that, because of which the state can penalize you also if you don't know their line. In that context, we have like Project Mukti, which is run by DBA women and trans women and persons who are fighting also on these lines. Then there is also Equality Labs, which is not in India, but is actually also looking at trans rights as well in the context of Brahmanism and all those intersections. So, how does this all fit in the in the homo populist framework? Ma'am, you're muted.
That's a very good question again. And I, again, do not have, I mean, I have an opinion on that, but I do not have a well-researched answer on that. My opinion is this, that of course, if we look at, so within the development discourse, we already have a whole host of research that says that the question of, for example, if we take the question of women in development, gender and development, and so on, we see that the way that gender has been mainstreamed in NGOs, many NGOs, there is a kind of, it's kind of saturated itself and depoliticized itself. And so it becomes a series of check marks in the development sector. So that has happened as far as, gender and development is concerned. Now, I do not, I mean, as far as my limited understanding goes, I do not see that yet the case, at least in the Indian context, as far as mainstreaming LGBTQIA rights to the extent in the development sector where there is, it has completely lost its political edge. I at least do not see that. There is of course a lot of, parallel work through healthcare and HIV/AIDS that goes on, and one can discuss that separately. But then, as far as directly, talking about, mainstreaming LGBTQIA rights as LGBTQIA rights within the NGO sector, I don't see that there, because that there is not a mandate for that. We still do not have really. I mean, several collectives, NGOs are really still fighting to even bring the issues of, hijra, koti, trans, lesbian, bisexual women, transmasculine persons within the ambit of acceptance and rights. So that would be my, opinion at the moment.
The next question is from Philip. Philip, would you please?
Yes, thank you very much. Firstly, thanks a lot for this fantastic presentation. I found it extremely informative, very well articulated. I have two questions. The first is, I think, more direct, and the second one I will ask with some trepidation, actually, because I'm not sure how I can clearly express myself about that. The first is, isn't the idea of nationalism in a way inherently anti-queer? Because nationalism imagines at least certain geographical, ethnic, racial, linguistic boundaries, whereas queer identities would perhaps insist on a fluidity and the embracing of, in inverted quotes, the other. And so aren't these two notions actually a bit antithetical to each other? And how would you reflect on that? My second question is actually with is about the question of transgender folk. It seems to me that within the Indian context in particular, and particularly as opposed to transphobia as articulated in the West, I mean, very recently through J.K. Rowling, but in other spaces as well, that in India, transgender folk have a certain acceptability in society as against other queer folk. No doubt, tremendous violence and discrimination, but there have been entry into the political space. I mean, it's always hitting the news that this trans person has become a mayor of a town or something like this. And perhaps this has linkages with a pre-colonial history where trans people had a certain ritual significance within society. All false, I mean, and the problematics with that, of course, but also on the other hand, with actually a very Western notion of sexuality, of being born this way. So a greater acceptability rather than homosexual practice, which could be seen as a matter of choice. And even within this, it seems to me that there's a certain hierarchy between different sexual orientations and how they express themselves. So for example, cisgender homosexual men stand higher on a hierarchy because of the entire national AIDS campaign and HIV awareness than, say, lesbian and bi women. So how do we negotiate these hierarchies that exist within the Indian context and their relationship with the state actually involving itself in a way, fixing these identities? Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for those questions. And as far as your first question is concerned, isn't nationalism anti-queer? Well, one would think that is the case, but it is really, nationalism has what recent global history has shown us, that nationalism really has had a way to encapsulate the others, the once others into its folds, And therefore, for example, the concept of homo-nationalism that has been, was a path-breaking concept by Poor to talk about how these once, exiled subjects are suddenly brought into the fold in post 9/11 politics of terror in order to justify military intervention and so on. So we have already, and then of course, now what we are trying to figure out through the concept of Hindu nationalism and Homo populism is to see how, Hindu nationalism itself actually, again, takes certain queer bodies into its folds by either referring to a pre-colonial past and saying that, this existed before, and therefore this is part of my national culture, or really, saying that, or maintaining a kind of complicit silence around it. So interestingly, even though nationalism, in a certain sense, the nation is conceptually, the nation, is created by, taking certain subjects into its fold and drawing boundaries between those subjects and those who cannot come into its fold. So in our context, in the Indian context, one can think about it in casteist and Islamophobic ways, the way that nationalism organizes itself by, keeping certain things in and keeping certain things out. So what comes in and what goes out, that is the question that one is trying to look at. So really, nationalism, finds very, finds moments to also bring into its fold queer subjects. Of course, the term queer then becomes very ironic, but that is what has happened. So queer by itself does not have necessarily an emancipatory quality to it. That is what we have to keep in mind as well. Secondly, if I get your question correctly, your second question in terms of acceptability, I would say that, yes, there are two ways to look at it. If we look at the question of pre-colonial history, then of course we can find moments where there is acceptability of whom we, now call Hijra, Koti, and trans persons. There is acceptability in a very superficial sense. But one has to keep in mind that acceptability, how do we judge that acceptability, or how do we understand or recognize that acceptability? Because, there is reference in certain texts. Now, scholars have also argued that the references that are there in these texts are very, hierarchical in themselves. They hark back to a certain past that is casteist, of which, we are a part now as well. And therefore, just talking about, acceptance of Hijra, Koti, trans persons in terms of a pre-colonial acceptability, because they have certain references in texts, would be to also not look at the kind of non-acceptances and violences that have been showered upon Hijra, trans, Koti persons. And so interestingly, what happens is that this link with the pre-colonial society is being put to question now, and is not a very easy connection. Now, when from the pre-colonial we go to the colonial, then of course what we know is that a pornotropic is created, as scholars have argued. So in other words, then what happens is that we are, the area that we are in is created as a pornotropic, where all these, the other of the British imperialists who are hypersexualized, etc., etc., are all there. And then now what we have through our populist nationalism is the porno West, right? That we connect to our pre-colonial past and the West becomes a porno West. So these are some things that I guess we need to think about when we think about questions of acceptability. Shoma has...
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so it was a very nice talk that you delivered. And I just had one question, not a specific question in general, but a sort of comment on it. So, I think that populism and majoritarianism, as you have told, is interlinked. So, be it in the sense of queer, Dalit, or majority or minority, in the sense of queer, Dalit, or majority minority interest, it comes with a consensus, a hegemonic consensus, as Gramsci has been enumerating. So that hegemonic consensus in most of the cases, in the case of majoritarianism or in the case of populist majoritarianism, it is manufactured. So in the context of queer politics, how do you think and in what ways this hegemonical consensus can be resisted in the discourse of Hindu populist narrative or meta-narrative of appropriation? So in that sense, how do you think we can resist this popular notion of appropriation by the mainstream political parties, or by mainstreaming specific queer political rights in the public arena?
Shoma, that's a very important question, and I really do not have an answer, to how it can be resisted. I think I do not, as an individual person, will have a roadmap for that. But what I can say is that, and that is why I have had that last bit in the, and that is what I really hope to do. Document, and there is, I think what we need to do is that there are voices that are already resisting it. So two things. One is that I do not want to say that queer politics in India is homopopulist. I do not want to make this generalized statement. I do not want to say queer politics in India is homo-nationalist, or queer politics in India is homo-Hindu nationalist. I mean, because queer politics has many faces in India, and therefore and that is why I'm hoping I'm able to convince some of you that I'm trying to push the concept of homopopulism, because I specifically want to break it down and look at some of the the connections between popular politics and majoritarianism, and how certain LGBTQ identified individuals are incorporating themselves in that, which does not mean that queer politics in India is homopopulist. A part of it is, but the rest of it, there is a lot of complexity. People are doing work in different cities, outside of the cities, in semi-urban areas, in the districts, and I think we need to go and document and see how they are working in their own areas. I think perhaps once these documentations are done, once these voices are heard, once these come into the academic folds in a much more robust way, we will probably be able to understand, where the resistances are. That's what I feel, and therefore I kind of end with that little teaser to say, what are some of the, alliances, or what are some of the moments in which queer subjects entered into and have entered into politics around sedition, around deepening democracy, around the anti-NRC movements and so on as queer subjects, not necessarily here in national politics talking about, oh, I need my right and then I'll go home, but actually, how many of us are there as a queer subject, right? So that if one is able to perhaps engage a little deeper into these questions, one can see at least the beginnings of how this can be resisted or are being resisted. Yes.
Piuli has a question. What role does the academic community in India have to play in homopopulism?
That's again a very important question. What role does the academic community? I always shy away from answering these very general questions about. But what I will say is that I will speak from my own position here, and I will say that from my own position, we still, within institutions, within academia, it is still very, very hard to talk about, or to generate courses on queer issues, on queer politics and so on. It is not a very easy, we have still not reached a point where I'm going to go to the board of studies and I'm going to say that, oh, I'm going to have a course on queer politics. It's not really that easy. So therefore, I do not have an answer to the question, what role does the academic community, because I do not, and perhaps in a way that is a good thing that queer studies is still not institutionalized in a way that it is in UK, in North America, and in the EU states. And because it is not institutionalized, so therefore we are still kind of under the radar, putting in our queer topics and our queer pedagogies into other courses. So perhaps that is a good thing. I really don't have an answer how they are playing into homopopulism, because I really do not see a critical mass of the academic community which is still able to bring in more and more courses around queer issues into institutions.
I was also wondering, I'm Kabuli, by the way. So I was also wondering is it possible for homopopulism and an anti-populist politics, anti-populist queer politics to side by side exist in the same space? For example, I remember when we were sloganeering in Pride last year, we were at the same time sloganeering against the NRC and the CAA. And at the same time, we were talking about the Trans Act, the NRC, the CAA, and the NPR, and at the same time talking about more inclusion of the queer community. And even as we were doing that, in order to mobilize other queer people, we would be going out, the mobilizers, the organizers of Pride would be going out to tell them. And I remember this is something that was said in one of the GBs of during the organizing process, that why would you not support people in Kashmir? They are a minority, you are a fucking minority. This is the exact language in which it was delivered. So even when we are addressing questions which are anti-homopopulist, maybe we are taking to a populist discourse to bring people in. So it's like two undercurrents existing at the same time, constantly conflicting with each other.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ikabuli, and this is these are very difficult moments, and I think that so there is the way that I see it. Again, this is my opinion and not I'm not talking from, some of it is experience and some of it is opinion, that what we see is that the question whether an anti-populist and anti-homo nationalist can exist together, it is difficult, but one can, you know, if one is dreaming of queer futures, then no, not impossible. I think perhaps, you know, the moment that you talked about, there has to be a constant critique and counter-critique, right? I mean, there has to be a constant critique and counter-critique. I mean, there is not a moment's rest. And of course, I mean, the thing is that, you know, if we go back to the history of populism, you know, in the United States, in the, you know, 19th century, in the 18th century, and we look at questions of populism, I mean, initially populism really arose out of a people's movement, really, to talk about, you know, the corrupt elite, which of course then gets appropriated later on through different histories. And then the elite itself, you know, incorporates this populist discourse to other, you know, different marginalized populations. And then when the marginalized themselves march on the streets and then uses certain popular strategies to at the same time denounce or not associate with, you know, some people and not others, it does become a very difficult moment. But from that, whether can we conclude whether we can have an anti-populist politics existing along with the homopopulism? Maybe if we can break it up and look at it in, I mean, right now, I do not see that it is able to exist. But I can also, you know, see that it is important for us to bring these different fragmentary moments together and see maybe how we can imagine a different world. I know this sounds very imaginary, but believe me, Ekabuli, at this moment, given the situations that we are in, I look for little moments to weave them together into a collective imaginary, rather than trying to look for a collective imaginary and then trying to see if that fits in with my current reality. This may sound, you know, perhaps a little dissatisfying to you, but that's how I am trying to deal with it. Yeah.
Shoma Marif has a question. She's asking, what are the mobilization strategies of homopopulism unleashed by corporate states and media?
Thank you, Shoma, for the question. So the thing is that, you know, as I mentioned in the presentation before, that what we see is that the, you know, that there are corporate sector, I mean, there are companies within the corporate sectors, there are, you know, media outlets which are using some of the very familiar language of inclusion, one, and two, using familiar language of development. So for example, the familiar language of development is empowerment. Familiar language of inclusion is, you know, anti-discrimination. So these are some familiar languages that are being used by, you know, corporate entities and media in order to, you know, popularize the LGBT issue. And of course, you know, we also know that, for example, Tata Consultancy and some other companies have introduced and are introducing some, you know, policies, one or two policies in order to really project themselves as this all-inclusive company. And it's great. I mean, I'm very happy for those employees, and these policies have to be absolutely there. I'm not specifically calling those policies homopopulist. Let me be very clear, because these policies are needed. I mean, let us not be, in our zeal to critique the connections between populism, Hindu nationalism, and certain neoliberal marginalizing tendencies, let us not say that rights and policies are useless. Absolutely, they are needed, because there is this other, side to it, which is anti-right and anti-policy that does not help many populations. And in many parts of Europe, we are increasingly seeing another kind of mobilization, which one of my colleagues is naming as heteroactivism, that is trying to take back the rights that have been given to LGBTQIA population. So I'm not saying that these policies are homopopulist. What I'm saying is that that the language of inclusion, is very popular, and it feeds into very familiar idioms of what empowerment means, what inclusion means, and therefore leaves out the larger, the majority of LGBTQIA identified people.
Thank you, Dr. Niharika Banerjea. What actually I wanted to ask this question as an activist and also as an academic, how to chalk out the resistance strategies by us, because you say, I agree with you, it's the policies are always welcome, but they are also the policies which try to cater to the agenda of the corporate media and the states. This I wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, again, the question of resistance, I mean, again, to go back to my earlier hesitance, that I'm always hesitant to say that this is the route to resistance and this is how we can resist. I would say that at this point, it's important to look into work that is already being done on the ground. That is already being done on the ground by different collectives and organizations across the nation, both in the cities, in the districts, in the rural areas, who are trying to, project alternative ways of living, alternative ways of engaging, with the social, with the state. I think we need to really go back to the ground and see how these things are being done, and then perhaps think about our imaginaries of resistance. So I would not give an answer to this is how we would resist. I would say that let's into ourselves, how each of us, are doing, into each other's work, and see how it is being done. And we need more research and work and studies on that, I would say. So in other words, what I'm trying to see is that we need to continuously go back to the grassroots movements, to the collectives, and see how, what is the language, what are the strategies of resistance from there, and whether they are feeding into, the popular narratives or not. If they are, then how to, present a critique right there and then, how much of it is strategic, whether it has a, potential for any kind of radical politics or not, or any strategic politics. These are some of the questions that I am trying to, think through, but really don't have a one size fits all answer at this time.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I don't think we have any more questions, do we? That was a very good talk and very enlightening. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to get in touch with Niharika Di. And I think I don't think we have any more questions. I think it's time we wrap up the talk.
Yeah, please. I would just like to say that thank you all very much for being here, and I would really very much welcome any more clarifications, questions, or questions that you have for me that will help me to think further through this. This medium is a little disorienting for me, so I welcome your questions even after this screen time. Yeah, and thank you, Ekabuli and the Queer Studies Cluster.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. I think it's time I end the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.